Welcome to Infidelity Files. It started with something so trivial, so utterly insignificant, that I still can't believe it would unravel everything. I was folding laundry in the living room when David yelled from the hallway, "Lorraine, can you help me with this?" I turned to find him standing at the foot of the stairs, struggling with his belt buckle. He was wearing loose-fitting khaki shorts, and the leather strap was twisted awkwardly. "Can you fix this?" he asked. "It's stuck or something." As he approached, I set aside the laundry and leaned in to untangle the belt. "Sure," I replied, trying to focus on the task at hand. "Older still," I muttered under my breath. "Sorry," he said, holding his breath as I tugged at the leather. But as I pulled, the buckle snapped, and before either of us could react, his shorts slid down to his ankles. Time seemed to freeze. My gaze darted downward for a split second, an involuntary reaction. A surge of electricity pulsed through the air, and his gaze lingered on mine as he quickly pulled his shorts back up. Sorry," he stammered, his face flushed. "It's okay," I managed to say, my cheeks burning. "It happens." "Yeah," he replied, his voice strained. "Thanks for the help." He turned and rushed upstairs, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding and my mind racing. It was just an accident, a brief moment of embarrassment. But the electric tension in the room, the way he looked at me, had shifted something. My marriage to Alan wasn't a love story. It wasn't terrible, just peaceful. A comfortable, predictable routine. We married when I was 44. He was 50. We were both coming off failed marriages, seeking stability. Alan was a man of habits. Golf on Saturdays, fishing on Sundays, endless client dinners. I'd learned to accept the quiet, to fill my days with charity work, gardening, and household chores. David, Alan's son from a previous marriage, had always been polite but distant. I'd only met him a few times, during awkward family holidays when he was still a college student. But the man who stood before me now was not the shy young man I remembered. David had just graduated, adrift in the world, his fine arts degree, something Alan still rolled his eyes at, not yielding immediate success. Alan, ever the pragmatist, offered him a place to stay until he got back on his feet. I wasn't consulted, but I didn't object. The house was big enough, and a bit of company wouldn't hurt. What I didn't expect was how quickly David would change the atmosphere of our home. He had a natural charisma, a dry wit that was both disarming and charming. His presence filled the empty spaces, bringing a vibrancy that Alan's stoic routine never could. It started with simple interactions, a casual conversation over morning coffee, sharing stories about college life, or a quiet moment in the living room as he sketched intricate drawings, his talent evident in every line. One day, I caught him doodling in a notebook. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked, pointing to the pad. He hesitated, then handed it over. The pages were filled with stunning sketches, portraits, landscapes, and abstract designs. "These are amazing," I said, genuinely impressed. "Thanks," he murmured, a hint of shyness in his voice, just something to pass the time. "You should show these to someone," I suggested. "A gallery and art director. You have real talent." He smiled, his eyes meeting mine. "You're the first one to say that." The weight of his words hung between us, a silent acknowledgement of something unspoken. Then came the belt incident, a seemingly insignificant moment that shifted the dynamic between us. The tension in the air was palpable, a charged energy that neither of us knew how to address. I tried to avoid him, but it was futile. The house was too small, the moments of shared silence too frequent. David appeared in the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower. "Lorraine," he said softly, the way he said my name sending a shiver down my spine. Yes, I replied, my heart pounding as I turned to face him. He hesitated, his hands tucked into the pockets of his pants. I apologized for the other day. It was embarrassing. It's all right, I said quickly, turning back to the sink. Let's just forget about it. I'm not sure I can, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I froze, the gravity of his words settling over me. Slowly, I turned to face him. David, we can't, I began, unsure of how to continue. He moved closer, his gaze unwavering. I know, but I don't want you to think it meant nothing to me. His voice was intense, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then Alan's voice broke the silence. I'll be right back, he called from the front door. I'll be there in a minute, I said hurriedly, pulling away from David. But even as I walked away, I knew something had changed between us, something irreversible. The following days were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. Alan, oblivious to the tension, spent his nights out, leaving David and me to navigate the complex situation we'd created. One afternoon, David found me folding laundry in the guest room. Can we talk? He asked, his voice uncertain. I paused, then nodded. He closed the door behind him. I don't know how to act around you anymore, he confessed, his voice rough. David, we need to let this go, I pleaded, my voice trembling. It wasn't just a moment, he insisted, stepping closer. Not for me. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. It was more than just a moment. There's a point of no return, a moment when you realize you've crossed a line. I knew it the first time David kissed me. It wasn't planned, it just happened. Late one night, after Alan had gone out, I was cleaning the kitchen when David walked in. Can't sleep, he admitted, leaning against the door frame. His hair was tousled, and his casual stance sent a thrill through me. We stood there in silence, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. When I finally looked up, the intensity in his eyes was overwhelming. Lorraine, he whispered, taking a step closer. David, don't, I warned, though my heart raced. I can't stop thinking about you, he whispered, his voice steady and sure. You have to, I replied, my voice quivering. This is wrong. You know that. I know, he murmured, closing the distance between us. But his eyes held a different message, a defiance that unsettled me. And then he kissed me. It was tentative at first, as if he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When we finally pulled apart, my heart was racing. I couldn't meet his gaze. This can't happen again, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. Neither did I. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken longing. We tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the tension between us was palpable. Every touch, every look was charged with a secret, a dangerous secret. Alan, blissfully unaware, went about his life, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing with fire. The second time happened in the garden. I was pruning the roses when David approached. You spend a lot of time out here, he observed, breaking the silence. It's peaceful, I replied, without looking up. He stepped closer, his shadow looming over me. I guess you like avoiding me. My breath caught, but I forced myself to remain calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? He asked, his voice low and urgent. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. His gaze was intense, unwavering. This time, there was no hesitation. He kissed me, and I kissed him back. What started as stolen moments blossomed into something neither of us could control. We were cautious at first, seeking secluded corners of the house. But as our bond deepened, our boldness grew. During one of Alan's business dinners, David and I met at the library. As I pretended to tidy the shelves, he approached, his breath warm on my neck. "You're shaking," he whispered. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice trembling. He took my shoulders, turning me to face him. "You're not scared of me," he said gently. "You're scared of what we're doing." I hesitated, the truth hanging heavy in the air. "I'm not scared of you," I admitted. "I'm scared of us." He cupped my face, his gaze steady. "Then don't think about it. Just be with me." I wanted to fight, to tell him we couldn't continue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let him pull me into his arms, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The thrill of our secret affair only intensified the longer it lasted. Every stolen moment felt like a rebellion against the mundane life I'd settled for, a reminder of the passion and desire still burning within me. But with the exhilaration came a growing fear. One afternoon, as David and I were sitting on the couch, Alan arrived home earlier than expected. "Lorraine," he called from the hallway. I jumped up, my heart pounding. "It's just Grant," I called back, trying to sound calm. Alan strolled in, his gaze flicking between us. "Didn't know you had company," he remarked, his tone casual, but his eyes held a knowing glint. David quickly recovered, offering a nonchalant explanation. Alan nodded, but the look he gave me as he walked away sent a shiver down my spine. As the weeks passed, Alan's questions became more pointed. "You and David seem to be getting along well," he observed one evening at dinner. "He's been a great help around the house," I replied, forcing a smile. Alan nodded, his expression inscrutable. "I'm glad to know someone's keeping you company while I'm working." His words were tinged with something I couldn't quite decipher, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. The first major breach in our carefully constructed facade came with the arrival of Grant, David's outspoken friend. Grant had a knack for seeing through people's facades. "You've been spending a lot of time at home," he remarked to David one afternoon, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Must be nice having someone to keep you company," he added, his gaze lingering on me. A shiver ran down my spine. Later, I found David in the kitchen. "Grant's on to us," I whispered, my voice trembling. David shook his head. "He's not stupid, Lorraine. He's going to figure it out." The tension in the house grew palpable. Every interaction, every shared glance was fraught with unspoken meaning. The threat of discovery loomed large, casting a shadow over our secret affair. But as the danger increased, so did my love for David. I couldn't imagine life without him. Keeping a secret is like trying to hold your breath underwater. Eventually, you have to come up for air. David and I were skilled at deception, but the cracks in our facade were beginning to show. And then there was Heather, Alan's colleague, whose increasingly frequent visits added another layer of complexity to our already precarious situation. Heather arrived on a Saturday afternoon, unexpected yet entirely at ease. She'd been to the house before, usually dropping off something for Alan, but this time she came bearing a bottle of wine and an overly bright smile. "I thought I'd stop by," she said, stepping into the kitchen where I was chopping vegetables. "Alan said you've been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately. I thought you could use a distraction." "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "But thank you." Heather set the wine on the counter and leaned against the island, her gaze sweeping across the room. "This place is lovely. You've done a wonderful job making it feel like home." "Thank you," I said, my voice stiff. Her eyes lingered on the back door, where David had just exited. "Alan's lucky to have you. And David, of course. He's a great help around here, isn't he?" "Of course," I replied, my heart pounding. "He's been wonderful. It's nice to have him around." Heather's smile was thin, her eyes sharp. "I believe it is." Heather's visits became more frequent, each one a thinly veiled intrusion. She dropped by under the guise of work, but her true intentions were clear. She was looking for something, whether it was information or Alan himself. One afternoon, as we sat in the living room, she remarked, "Alan doesn't talk much about his personal life, but I get the impression that things haven't been great between the two of you." I stiffened, my grip tightening on my teacup. "Every marriage has its ups and downs," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Oh, I'm sure," Heather said, her tone laced with feigned sympathy. "But having David around really helps. He seems very attentive." The implication was clear, and a wave of fear washed over me. Then there was Grant, David's best friend, always blunt and observant. He'd started to notice the change in David's behavior. "You've been spending a lot of time with Lorraine lately," he'd said one evening, leaning back in his chair. "Must be nice having someone to keep you company." David shrugged, trying to play it off. "She's my stepmother. Of course we talk." "Yeah, but there's something more going on, isn't there?" Grant pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Something about her." David's grip tightened on his beer bottle. "What are you trying to say?" he demanded. "I'm saying you're acting weird, and it's not just because of work. There's something else going on, and I think it has to do with her." David stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. Grant's eyes narrowed. "Don't I?" The tension in the house was palpable. Every interaction with Alan felt like a minefield. Every visit from Heather a potential disaster. The secret we were keeping was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded. David's frustration with our secret situation was growing. "I can't keep doing this," he said one night, his voice low and intense. "We have to be careful," I replied, my voice trembling. "Careful isn't enough," he retorted. "Grant is suspicious, Heather is snooping, and Alan isn't as oblivious as you think." I averted my gaze, tears welling up in my eyes. "What do you suggest? That we stop?" he asked, his voice softening. "You know I can't do that, but we have to figure something out, because this isn't sustainable." The breaking point came during a dinner party that Alan insisted on hosting. Heather was there, along with a few of Alan's colleagues. David had invited Grant, who arrived with a knowing glint in his eye. The evening started innocently enough, with polite conversation and clinking glasses. But as the night wore on, the tension grew. "So, Lorraine," Heather said, her voice cutting through the noise, "how do you keep yourself busy with Alan away so often?" I froze, her question loaded with implication. "The usual things," I replied, forcing a smile. "Gardening, reading, and helping David with various tasks." Heather's lips curled into a smirk. "You must be quite close then." Across the table, Grant raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, David's been spending a lot of time here lately. I guess it makes sense. Lorraine's pretty easy to talk to." A heavy silence fell over the table. Alan's gaze flickered between us, his expression unreadable. Heather sipped her wine, a smug smile playing on her lips. David pushed back his chair abruptly. "Excuse me," he muttered, storming out of the room. "I think I'll check on him," I said, rising quickly before anyone could stop me. I found David in the garden, pacing in the dim light. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice thick with anger. "What was that?" I asked, my heart pounding. "All of it," he replied. "Grant is on to us. Heather is suspicious. Alan isn't as oblivious as we think. We can't keep doing this, Lorraine. It's falling apart." I reached out and touched his arm. We'll figure something out, I promised. But as I looked into his despairing eyes, I knew we were running out of time. The sound of footsteps on the gravel interrupted our moment. We both turned to see Alan standing at the edge of the garden, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the patio lights. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. We stood there, frozen, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. "We were just talking," I began, attempting a weak smile. Alan cut me off. His voice was sharp, his eyes hard. "It's interesting how you two seem to have so much to say to each other these days." David stiffened, his jaw clenched. "Is there a problem, Alan?" he asked, his voice strained. Alan smirked, his tone icy. "I'm not sure, David. Should there be?" The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't suspicion anymore. He knew. "I think I'll go inside," David said, his voice firm but trembling. "No," Alan snapped, leaving no room for argument. "You will stay right here." David paused, his eyes locked with Alan's. Then he turned and walked back towards the house. Alan turned his attention back to me. "Can you explain why my wife and son are sneaking around in the garden during a dinner party?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The tension in the air was palpable. The next day, Alan was colder than ever. His every word was a dagger, his every glance a judgment. David tried to keep his distance, but it only made matters worse. Heather, of course, seized the opportunity to stir the pot. "I couldn't help but notice the tension last night," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. What could David have had to say that was so important? My mind raced as I tried to figure out what David might have told her. When I finally found him, he was waiting at the bridge. "You shouldn't have approached me," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I didn't have a choice," he replied, his eyes dark with anger. "Heather knows. She knows everything, and she's using it against us." My stomach churned. "What did she say to you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "She wanted me to confess," he said, his voice cold. "To tell Alan the truth. Lorraine, she's playing us both." I closed my eyes, the weight of the situation crushing me. "We're running out of time," I murmured. David took my hand, his touch grounding me. "We'll figure this out," he promised. But as I looked into his eyes, I wasn't so sure.